Great. I've had a chance to get mic'd up, clear my throat, and I think I'm ready. How many of you have ever driven a stick shift, a manual car? Yeah. So you know when you drive in 5th gear? That was yesterday. Today we're going to shift down to 3rd and 4th gear. We're going to go at a slightly less hectic pace, but still we're going to cover quite a lot. So when I saw the title of this, From Margins to the Mainstream, you know, the word mainstream has not always, it has a complex history because it's associated with gender mainstreaming, which is sometimes thought of as some of the older approaches to women and gender in development. So I would like to think, rather than from margins to mainstream, I'd like to think from margins to transformation, rather than mainstream, because sometimes the mainstream is the orthodox, is the core, right? It is the center of where the power relations are, although we do need to break down those doors. So just that thought. Okay, so the aims of these, I think they're in the program, so we don't have to really go through this, but they're up there. The key readings, so this is a really famous seminal book called Beyond Economic Man, and it came out in the 90s, and then I guess 93, and 10 years later they wrote a follow-up book, Beyond Economic Man, 2003, and even though it's a little dated, I put it as a key reading, and then I put in a more recent one, which has to do with moving beyond GDP as the 2 key readings, and I'm sure you've read it cover to cover and memorized it. So what I'm going to be talking today is about the visibility and institutional uptake of feminist economics, a little bit about the production of knowledge, and then strategies for transformation. Now, in terms of visibility and institutional uptake, when we look at out there in the mainstream, and we've talked a lot about the discipline of economics, and what people have written and what people have been saying in this session is that neoclassical economics, orthodox economics, seems to be entrenched, seems to be ingrained. It's a very narrow way of knowing, but it's also a hostile environment to feminists and to gender perspectives. So it's hostile to feminist economics, which is really important because it is the field of economics, but it's also hostile to any kind of gender transformative perspective. And even in terms of education, you know, there's all kinds of work that's been done around the lack of traction in mainstream economics. But I would say also in development studies as well. You know, if you take a degree, as I did, in international development, it was very, very mainstream. I had to hide in the Department of Geography and Anthropology to really get the critical perspectives, which I don't know what that says. That was a while back. And then we look at the development institutions. We talked about them yesterday, the IFIs, the International Financial Institutions. And within the International Financial Institutions, there's these things called the MDBs. Do you know what that is? MDB? Multilateral Development Bank. That's what we were talking about yesterday, right? The World Banks, somebody mentioned the African Development Bank and all the other banks. And they really are the locus for a lot of the loans, the grants to the nation states. They form a lot of the development assistance and the work that takes place. They're kind of like intergovernmental organizations, not quite, but they have representation of every nation state. So like the World Bank has votes, right? But if you actually start to look at the structure of, let's say, the World Bank, who has the biggest voting rights?
United States.
Yeah, exactly, the United States. It's a development bank, right? And then you start looking at how many votes European countries have and how many votes a country like Vanuatu has, or Lesotho, or Malawi, and you start to notice
power imbalance.
A power imbalance, exactly. Yeah, so when we look at, and then of course there's the IMF, right, which actually dictates a lot of the terms of finance, of debt relief, and was responsible for some of the things I talked about yesterday around structural adjustment programs, right? So these are powerful institutions. And where are they located? Where is the headquarters of the World Bank?
Washington.
Washington. Where's the headquarters of the IMF? Okay. Do you see where I'm going with this? Okay, good. So, you see this kind of hierarchy, right? This power imbalance, power hierarchy. And then we look at, I want to talk about private sector and corporations because they play such a huge role in our world. So if any, I know a lot of you work on climate change. Raise your hand if you work on climate change. Yesterday, okay, good. And so you all know about the UNFCCC, right? The United Nations Framework for Climate Change, Convention on Climate Change. So what we were seeing in the last few years is the infiltration of fossil fuel interests and actors into the climate change negotiations. So yes, the UN system was created post-World War II, but the world has changed and these corporations have gained a lot of power. And if you look, yesterday I mentioned that list of billionaires, right? And as I said, they're all men. The second trend you notice is that they're all from the global north, mostly. There are a couple from the global south, or is it the global south? I'm going to come to that question in a second. So there's a billionaire from India, right, who had a very famous wedding last year, and it was all over the news, right? Millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on a wedding. And in China as well, right? Anyways, but my point I'm trying to make here is that the world order has changed. So the politics have also changed. And in terms of policy spaces, we still see lots of gaps around feminist economics. The kind of concepts and the vision and the mission of feminist economics still quite struggling. Now there is something which I'll come back to and somebody else is going to be talking about, is pushing back against GDP, which structures the world a lot. And there's space in that, moving beyond GDP, to count women's work and to have some of the principles of feminist economics in those policy spaces. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute as well. I also want to look at visibility and because that's all the negative stuff, right? And I'm supposed to be talking how it's mainstream. But you can just, just from this exercise, you can see how the negative is heavier than the light. Feminist economics light. So feminist economics as a field of its own, what's really amazing, it is really a big tent. So myself as an anthropologist, I attend these meetings, the IAFE, the International Association for Feminist Economics. I do attend them as an anthropologist, and I find them, I learn a lot, and I find it open to other social scientists. So it is a big tent, it's a welcoming tent, and you see collaboration with other feminist voices, other disciplines, other social science, and that's great. And you also see this methodological openness towards qualitative, ethnographic methods and mixed methods. I think Sarah yesterday, as she was analyzing the Journal of Feminist Economics, talked about this, so I won't go into it. But it really is, feminist economics, like what is it? Is it a discipline? Is it a sub-discipline? Is it a field of study? What is it? And it's been proposed that it's actually like, it could be more like a gender forum to advance gender equality, from different perspectives. Although the economic side of it, what we talked about yesterday, assets, labor, maybe going beyond labor, still tends to be, the central focus. I want to talk about EAFE, the conference. So there's been 32 conferences every year. Guess how many out of the 32 were in the global north? 99%? 90%? 70? 99? Okay. So 72% were held in the global north. 72%, 23 of them were held in the global north. That means 9 of them were held in the global south. That's 28%. Now, global south. So I started to look at each of these countries. And I was like, well, wait a second. China, Turkey, South Korea, are these global south countries? And so I started to look at the fact that actually, out of those 9 global south countries, actually they're all middle income countries. And 8 of them are upper middle income countries. Only 1 lower middle income country, which was Ghana. But all of them are middle income countries. Not according to the IMF and the World Bank, the world is divided up into HICS, MICS, and LDCs. Higher income countries, middle income countries, and least developed countries, right? So that's interesting, right? If we start to unpack what we mean by that. So we're going to come back to that question in the next few minutes about what is the global south and what is the global north. But what we want to conclude with is, like, there is growing recognition about feminist economics, and I'm amazed in the beginning, in the introductory session, about how many things everybody's working on that really is, core to feminist economics, but there's still miles to go, right? Especially from a global south perspective, right? Okay. All right. In terms of visibility and uptake, there are other fields that are not labeled as feminist economics, but where feminist economics ideas are in line and overlap centrally with these other fields. So one of them I've mentioned a lot is degrowth, or moving beyond GDP. That is where there's a lot of overlap. But it's interesting because I was at the EAFE in Cape Town, but there was an EAFE last year is Rome, right? Was it Rome?
It was this year.
Okay. But it was, that's right, it was this year. So I was at the one in Cape Town, and there was only like 1 or 2 sessions on degrowth. And I thought that there would be more sessions on degrowth. But even though they might not be represented at EAFE, that doesn't mean that there aren't discussions. There's a lot of discussions going on around moving beyond GDP from a feminist economics perspective. There's a lot of discussion around like global south perspectives that, the things that we've mentioned here that align with feminist economics thinking. A lot of the decolonial thinking and concepts also align with feminist economics. We talked about some of those yesterday, right? About the core and the periphery, and about power relations that continue, that disadvantage the global south. And then there's climate loss and damage. How many of you have heard of this term, climate loss and damage? Right, what it means, so the International Court of Justice just delivered judgment. It actually wasn't a judgment, it was an opinion. And basically they said that, because that's important, it's an opinion, but what they said was that all the harm and the damage that the global north has done to the global south, it actually owes the global south, right? Basically, in a nutshell. So climate loss and damage means that all the loss and the damage that has happened to countries because of the overconsumption, the climate emissions beyond the ecological footprint that has caused a lot of climate change, disasters, the global north actually owes compensation to the global south. So this is really, really important, and I think it fits very well with some of the issues around feminist economics, around justice, around rights that we talked about. So we start to get into some very complex questions, I think, around the production of knowledge. So we talked about relations of power. We've talked about colonial continuities and histories. So we all understand what's at play. There's the history of colonialism, and there's all these colonial continuities that have been entrenched in these new institutions that were founded in the post-World War II era, IMF, World Bank, all these global north-driven kind of institutions that still to this day, where the global north has disproportionate voting power, right? I think everyone gets that, right? Okay. I'm going to complicate things a little bit. Okay, are you ready for a little bit of complication? A little bit of complexity? Okay. But if you think of power as something that's vertical, so we're talking about hierarchies, the global north, all the people in power, global south, right? The verticality of power. Sometimes power works the other way. Okay? So when we think about early on in development, we didn't have BRICS. What is BRICS? What is the BRIC group? Brazil,
India,
China, and South Africa, right? So we have these countries, and I was thinking when I was doing that IAFE list, that maybe at the time when those conferences were held in those countries that are now upper middle income, maybe at the time when they were holding the conference, they were still LDCs. That's another layer of analysis I haven't done, but as of today, they're all mixed, right? But so things are evolving, things are changing, and things are measured by GDP per capita. How do you graduate? So there's this linear development path. The people at the end are the LDCs, the people in the middle are the middle income countries, and the people who are developed are the high income countries, right? And how do you graduate from one thing to the other? It's based on one sole number, GDP per capita. But that doesn't tell you about redistribution, doesn't tell you about elite capture, doesn't tell you about gender equality. There's a lot of things that are left out in GDP per capita, right? So those are all questions. And also, there is capture of wealth, extreme wealth. And this is something in the last decade or decade and a half, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008, we've seen the capture of extreme wealth in the hands of a few people in the global north, but also the global south, right? And I mean, last night we were talking about, because we were talking about journal articles, but there's this trend where in China, people will take an English, I don't know who these people are, but they'll take English or other articles in other languages, like almost like plagiarize it and publish it in Chinese. Now, how will I ever know that my article is published in Chinese? That someone else, there's no way. So are we still talking about global north, global south? What are we talking about now? It's starting to get a bit murky and messy, right? Okay. So if we look at the critical interrogation of power, and we want to unpack global north and global south and critical interrogation of power, let me ask you, do you think there's pockets of the global south that exist in the global north? Do you agree with that? When you think about the inner cities in the United States that are mostly African American and rates of poverty that are pretty dire, is the global north a homogeneous place?
No.
In my own country, in Canada, if you go to any, we call the indigenous people, we call them the First Nations. If If you go to any First Nation reservations, they still exist, and you look at the poverty levels, it is shameful, shameful. So is the global north a homogenous place? No, it's not. And if we look at the global south, we can find examples. So when I was doing my research in Kenya, there was this report that came out called the Ndungu Report. Is anybody familiar with the Ndungu Report? No? It was published. It was made sorry, Ndungu. It was made public. It was a public report, and it showed that there's a concentration of wealth and land in the hands of just a few people in Kenya. This was in the late 90s, right? So I think we have to, so let me ask you, do you think the global north exists in the global south? Yes. The billionaire from India, what was his name? Do you remember? Ambani, right? Serious, he's on the top 10 billionaire list. Does the global north exist in the global south? If you can spend millions and millions and millions on a wedding, US dollars, right? So I think we have to also just warn ourselves about these homogenizing kind of labels that we use. That does not erase the history. That does not erase that the financial institutions and the development institutions are still powered by the global north. It doesn't erase all that. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that there's a lot of space for solidarity. Yeah? There's a lot of struggle happening in the global north, and you know, these days in North America, but with all the things, the political upheavals, the number of homelessness has increased in the United States, in Canada. So there's a lot of interesting and worrying trends that are happening in the global north as well. So I told you I was going to make things a bit complex and messy, right? But I think it's really important to ask these questions of what do we mean by global north and global south, and to unpack these questions. And so we go back to the question of intersectionality, right? We talked about it's not just a question of gender, it's not just a question of global north, global south, we're also talking about class, right? We're also, somebody mentioned somebody you know, becomes a widow and they lose their rights. We're talking about marital status, we're talking about age. So there's all these differences that we have to consider that make the analysis a bit complex. But now let's move to a slightly positive space, if we can. There are strategies for transformation. There are positive things going, so we shouldn't get too depressed. The United Nations Secretary General just put together a high-level working group on degrowth. Awesome. And there Naila Kabir's on it, feminist, right? Awesome. Joseph Stiglitz on it, and he's also a man, but I would say a feminist economic, right? A lot of the things that he's been saying for years are very important for feminist economics. Reframing the development architecture, there's a lot of discussion that's been going on around that, a lot of meetings that have been held around that. Putting care work into policy, into laws, into like, you know, maternity leave, childcare. Just to give you an example, in the province of Quebec, it's subsidized childcare. So it's like you pay $10 a day. I was just visiting a friend of mine in the United States, and for 1 month, it's $3,000 US a month. You know, so you can see, so when it's subsidized, it matters, and also counting it in the national system of accounts. There's so much that can be done around care, and I think there's a whole session on care, so we'll hear a lot more about it. I don't want to, and then food sovereignty. You know, the importance of having enough food, being sovereign, and here we're not just talking about eating bread all day, you know, it's also the quality. Nutrition is really important, because later on, if you don't have nutrition, it impacts your health, right? Food sovereignty, there's issues around, there's a lot of work being done against resource extraction that's unfair, around mining. I think we've heard some examples yesterday around it. Legal rights. First of all, legal rights to women, to humans, to children, but also to ecological systems. It's really important if we are going to address the climate emergency. I think a lot of ecological systems need legal rights. A lot of work's being done on modern slavery and unfree labor, which still exists today, trafficking. So feminist economics, they're right in there working around this issue, And then so this I'm getting, these are some of the things that came up in your second reading, the really small article by Oxfam on GDP, moving beyond GDP in the African context. And they're talking about Pan-African values, solidarity. Can we work together, across our differences and have some sort of a Pan-African solidarity around these issues? And Global South solidarity as well. Can we work across regions and come together and work in solidarity together? And I think, I just talked about how there's pockets of the Global South in the North and there's pockets of the Global North and the Global South. I think there's also some argument for global solidarity. And I feel so bad that since Beijing there hasn't been another conference on women, but I can tell you that conference was incredibly energizing. And you got the sense that it didn't matter where you came from. You just felt energized by the power of all these women trying to make a change. Latin American women talking to, South Asian women in all kinds of, directions. So I feel like there's a lot we can do to tap into that solidarity towards transformative power, to talk across our differences, common themes. Remember that these issues exist in other regions too, right? Yeah? Just think about women in Tibet. Think about women in Myanmar. Think about women in the low-lying Pacific Islands that are about to lose the actual land that they stand upon because of sea level rise. There's so many examples I can give, right? And what it does is it makes feelings of empathy and compassion rise up, right? You feel that, you feel like there's struggle, and I think it's so important to think about that solidarity as well. So this is where I'm going to wrap up.